Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I learned exactly what my mother thinks I am worth, and it was not whispered in a hallway or hinted at behind closed doors. It was delivered straight to my face at her own birthday party, with a glass of wine in her hand and a laugh that was just sharp enough to cut through the music. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was never getting a cent because I had always been a disappointment, and while everyone else chuckled as if it was some kind of edgy family humor, I felt that familiar wave of humiliation start to rise in my chest. The one I have carried since childhood, the one I used to swallow down to keep the peace. But this time I did not swallow it. I took a slow sip of my drink, looked back at her with the calmest face I could manage, and told her that was fine, because I was only there to celebrate and to tell her I was moving abroad for good. The smile slid off her face before the glass even touched the table again, and in that moment, I knew I had finally cut the cord she had kept wrapped around my neck for decades. To understand why that single exchange hit like a hammer, you need to know how the pattern had been built. For as long as I can remember, my brother Tyler was the golden child, the one who could crash a car, quit a job, bounce checks, and somehow still be greeted as the family's great hope. I, on the other hand, could pay bills on time, hold down a career, and take care of my grandmother Ruth's doctor appointments, yet my role was never celebrated. It was expected, and then minimized, as though responsibility was simply the consolation prize handed to the less favored child. Every family gathering turned into a backhanded performance review, with my mother Diane finding new ways to remind me that I was steady, but uninspired, reliable, but disappointing. And the cruelest part was how she dressed it all up as jokes, knowing that if I protested, I would look humorless, the uptight daughter who could not take a laugh. What she did not know was that over the past year I had quietly been preparing my exit. I had accepted a remote transfer with my company to their European office, signed a contract, and already wired the deposit on a small apartment. My passport renewal was back, my bank accounts were separated from every shared tie, and my credit report was locked tighter than a vault. The only thing I had been waiting for was the right moment to make it final, not in a text, not in a private phone call, but in the exact type of setting where she usually staged her little power plays. I wanted her to hear it in front of the very people she used to shape the narrative, so that for once she would not be able to spin it later as me being dramatic or ungrateful. The truth would land where it needed to land, in the open. As I said those words, I felt something I had never felt in that house before. It was not adrenaline, it was not rage, it was a kind of stillness, the type of clarity you only get when you know there is no turning back. I had walked into that party expecting her usual digs, but the harshness of her sentence, telling me flat out that I was worthless to her, that even in her imagined future I was excluded, gave me the final permission slip I did not even realize I was waiting for. And that is why I smiled as I added that I had brought a few envelopes as a thank you, small things I had prepared to close certain chapters before I left. The look on her face told me she did not understand what I meant, and for the first time in my life, I felt the power shift onto my side of the table. I know some people will ask, why not just walk away quietly? Why make a scene at a party? But here is what I learned after years of trying to handle it in private. Silence only protected her version of events. Every time I avoided conflict, she rewrote the story, told relatives that I was sensitive, told neighbors that I was distant, told Tyler that I was jealous, and the cycle kept repeating. Public clarity was the only kind of clarity that could not be denied. I was not there to embarrass her for sport. I was there to make sure she could never again claim ignorance of what I had chosen. When I handed her the first envelope, she looked at it as though I had just set down a live grenade, and maybe in her world it was exactly that, because it represented the first time I was not playing by her script. I told her, calmly, that inside she would find something that explained why I had stopped trusting her years ago, and that it was not meant for revenge, but for record. And then, without raising my voice or changing my tone, I added one last sentence that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Here's what no one will ever tell you about control. It only works when people stay silent. I left the envelope in her hand, let the silence spread for a moment, and took another sip of my drink. What happens when someone who has always pulled the strings suddenly realizes the strings are gone? That was the question hanging in the air as the party noise started up again. People pretending not to notice the shift, but everyone knowing they had just witnessed something they were not meant to. I saw Tyler watching me with that half-amused, half-nervous look he gets when he senses trouble, but cannot yet decide if it will benefit him or not. I saw Aunt Marcy tilting her head, already calculating which side she would need to land on to stay comfortable. And I saw my grandmother Ruth, quiet in her chair, giving me the smallest nod, like she had been waiting her whole life for me to finally draw a line. So that is where the first chapter closed, with a laugh turned into a glare, with a public toast turned into a declaration, with an envelope unopened, but heavy enough to shift the air in the room. And before anyone could ask me what was inside or what I was planning next, I left them with a question that I knew would keep them restless until the answer came. Can you guess what happened next? When I handed my mother that first envelope, I could see her fingers stiffen around it like she was holding something dangerous, and the truth is, she was. Because tucked inside was the one piece of paper that explained better than any fight or long argument why I had finally reached the point of no return, and it was not written by me but by a bank investigator who had confirmed, in precise and bureaucratic language, that years ago someone had opened a credit card in my name when I was still a teenager, and that the someone had sat behind a family desktop computer at our old house on a Sunday afternoon while I was at work bagging groceries. The letter included the IP address, the date, and the proof that the application had not come from me, and although I had never pressed charges because I chose instead to protect my credit score by quietly paying it off piece by piece, the paper carried a weight that even her laughter could not deflect. The moment she pulled the sheet out and realized what it was, I swear the air in the room shifted, because for once, her polished mask cracked in front of an audience, and while she tried to laugh it off with some vague comment about mistakes of the past, I spoke over her in a steady tone that left no room for reinterpretation. I said I had spent years covering up financial messes that should never have landed on my back, and that the only reason I had been able to move forward in my adult life was because I stopped trusting family assurances and started trusting the cold, dry language of credit alerts and legal documents. I explained that I was not there to accuse her, because I had already chosen the harder route of forgiveness through silence, but that forgiveness did not mean I had forgotten, and from that day forward, there would be no more accounts, no more plans, and no more access that allowed anyone in that room to jeopardize my stability again. It might sound clinical, but that was exactly the point, because I learned long ago that rage only fuels her version of the story, where I am ungrateful, dramatic, and impossible to please, so instead of shouting, I laid out my decisions as if I were presenting a compliance review at work. I told them that as of last week I had formally removed myself from every shared plan and account. No more family phone bill, no more emergency contact listing that let unpaid hospital charges land in my lap, no more cable subscriptions where my card was temporarily listed until reimbursements that never arrived. Every tie was cut, every password changed, every detail backed by documentation, and I had hard copies of each one in case there were doubts. For years my mother used the family gatherings to imply that I was the needy one, that I borrowed money, that I drained resources, and that Tyler only struggled because he was so busy carrying me, and that narrative stuck because no one ever saw the receipts, and I was too exhausted to correct it. But this time I came prepared, and instead of defending myself, I turned her own strategy on its head by thanking them all, loudly and sincerely, for the loans they thought I had taken. Because the truth was that those supposed handouts were just cover stories my mother used to excuse the cash she funneled to Tyler every time his latest project or habit spiraled. I told them I had never received those loans, that what I had given was not gossip, but documented transfers to keep utilities on when the checks bounced, and that I no longer carried that weight. Then, before anyone could interrupt, I announced that I had taken the money I had originally set aside to cushion myself against the next family emergency and redirected it into something that would outlast every argument. A scholarship fund named after my grandmother Ruth, created specifically for local community college students who worked while studying and had no parental cosigners willing to back their loans. I said it plainly, without flair, because I wanted the contrast to sting. For years I had been told I was selfish, yet the one act of selfishness I refused to allow was watching other kids go through the same traps I had been forced into. The application guidelines were already live, the fund had already been announced to the college, and the first award cycle would open in the fall. My mother's name was nowhere near it. I cannot fully describe the look on her face when she realized I had not only walked away from her system, but had built an entirely separate structure in which her approval meant nothing. She tried to mutter that I was stealing attention, that I was using Grandma's name without permission, but Grandma simply patted my hand and whispered, "Good for you," and that moment cut sharper than anything else, because my mother has always relied on Grandma's quiet deference to back her stories. When Ruth sided with me in public, even with only a few words, it landed harder than any speech could have. I could feel the room getting restless, with Tyler rolling his eyes like I was dragging down the party, and a few cousins shifting uncomfortably as if they wished they had not come. So I leaned back, picked up my glass, and with the calmest smile I could manage, I turned to Tyler and asked him for the car keys. At first, he blinked like he thought I was joking, then smirked in that way he does when he thinks he has already outsmarted me, and he said I would never dare to pull a stunt like that because family loyalty always stopped me at the last second. I let him laugh, then I set my glass down and told him that was interesting, because just outside, a tow truck was idling at the curb, paperwork already in order, and by the time he finished his drink, the title transfer he had ignored would no longer be theoretical. The smirk slipped, and I could see his mouth open to argue, but I cut him off with one last line, one that had been burning in my chest for months. "Can you guess what this really is?" And as the glow of the truck's lights started to wash across the front windows, the party fell into a silence that was heavier than any music, because for the first time, my brother realized I was not bluffing, and my mother realized she had no script to cover this scene. The second I mentioned the tow truck, I could see the color drain from Tyler's face in a way I had not seen since we were teenagers, and he realized one of his impulsive decisions had spiraled into something he could not talk his way out of. And as the truck's slow roll up the driveway became audible over the muffled music inside, every guest shifted uncomfortably because they knew, without me saying much more, that this was not just another sibling spat or petty drama, but the culmination of years of hidden paperwork, unpaid bills, and sacrifices that had quietly fallen on my shoulders without anyone acknowledging them. The truth is, the car in question had been mine on paper for years, not because I wanted it, but because Tyler needed a cosigner after wrecking his credit before he even turned 25, and while my mother promised it would be temporary. What actually happened was predictable. He missed payments, ignored notices, and then, when the lender threatened repossession, my name was the one in the crosshairs. For months, I had debated whether to let it slide again, to cover his mess just to keep the peace, but something inside me shifted when I realized how much power lived in those signatures and dates, and instead of absorbing yet another financial hit, I decided to play by the rules he assumed I would never enforce. I caught the payments up, filed the necessary paperwork to secure title in my name, and quietly arranged for the car to be legally removed the first chance I had to confront the situation in public. The timing was deliberate because if I had done it behind closed doors, my mother would have spun the story into one of betrayal or cruelty, but in the bright light of her party, surrounded by neighbors, family, and even our longtime neighbor Deputy Cole, who happened to be a guest that evening, there was no room for fiction, only the undeniable presence of a truck and a driver with paperwork to back every move. Tyler, of course, tried to turn the moment into theater, stepping forward with that cocky grin he uses when he wants to appear unbothered, insisting that no tow truck could take his car because he had the keys in his pocket. And when the driver calmly explained that keys were irrelevant when a title transfer had already been processed through the state and certified mail had been sent to the last known address, his grin faltered for just a beat. My mother immediately leapt in, her voice rising with that sharp edge she uses when she wants to intimidate, demanding that the truck leave and threatening to call the police. But before she could escalate further, Deputy Cole cleared his throat and reminded her that he actually was the police, albeit off duty, and that everything he had just seen looked perfectly legal, perfectly in order, and perfectly timed. The silence that followed was thick, not because anyone truly believed Tyler had been wronged, but because most of them had never seen me assert authority in such a calculated way. For years I had played the role of fixer behind the scenes, patching problems so the family image could stay intact, and now I was letting that image crumble in front of everyone, not with anger, but with documentation. I explained, calmly and deliberately, that the car was never fully his, that every missed payment had landed in my lap, and that I had carried the late fees and the threats long enough. The car would now be liquidated, the outstanding debt covered, and any surplus directed toward cleaning up the very financial wreckage he left behind. This was not vengeance, it was accountability delivered in the one language no one in that household ever respected until now: paper and action. Tyler tried to physically block the tow truck, puffing up his chest like he had in every high school fight he barely survived, but the driver, a seasoned professional who had clearly seen worse, simply waited with quiet patience, paperwork in hand. Until the moment passed. My mother barked at me to stop the humiliation, claiming I was making a spectacle out of family business, but I turned to her and, in the same calm tone I had used all evening, reminded her that this spectacle had existed for years. Only it had always been hidden behind my silent payments and her carefully curated image. Now the mask was off, and everyone could finally see what I had been carrying alone. The truck hooked the car, and as the sound of the chain tightened, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for more than a decade. For once, Tyler's mess was not mine to absorb. For once, the consequences were landing where they belonged. He cursed under his breath, muttering that I was betraying family, but I did not rise to it, because I knew the truth. Loyalty is not covering for someone who never intends to change. Loyalty is refusing to be destroyed by the same cycle over and over. I had reached the point where his survival no longer depended on my sacrifice, and I let the silence of the crowd absorb that truth better than any speech could. When the car finally rolled off down the street, my mother's face was twisted in fury, but beneath it, I caught the flicker of fear, because she understood better than anyone what this meant. If I had the courage and preparation to pull this off, then there was no telling what else I had been setting in motion quietly in the background. She pointed at me, voice shaking not from emotion but from rage at losing control, and accused me of exploiting Grandma Ruth, of using her name to justify my schemes, of taking and taking without ever giving back. The accusation was absurd to anyone who knew the truth, but it was classic Diane, pivoting the story to paint herself as protector while I became the villain. I let her finish, then turned to the guests with a steady voice and said, "Only 1% of people ever bother to learn this secret. Paperwork always wins." And with that, I reached into my bag and pulled out a second envelope, this one not for her but for Aunt Marcy, who had been watching the whole scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between curiosity and dread. I handed it to her without explanation, letting the weight of the gesture land, because everyone in that room knew that whatever was inside had the potential to dismantle another layer of the story my mother had carefully built for years. And as Aunt Marcy's fingers hovered over the seal, I looked back at my mother, who had finally stopped speaking, and I told her in the calmest, most deliberate tone I could muster, "Here's what happens when silence ends." The room froze again, every eye flicking between my mother's glare and my aunt's trembling hands, and I could feel the anticipation building, because the party had shifted from celebration to reckoning, and no one knew exactly what truth would come spilling out next. Aunt Marcy's hands shook in that small, involuntary way people try to hide when they sense the ground is shifting under them, yet she still broke the seal because curiosity has always been the one honest engine in this family. And when her eyes moved across the first page, I could see the moment the familiar script started to unravel, since what I had given her was not a speech or a plea or some messy account of hurt feelings, but a short cover letter followed by a neat stack of statements that mapped out, line by line and month by month, the exact amounts I had transferred during the last few years to keep the lights on at my mother's house, to reset the internet when it had been disconnected, to cover an insurance payment that would have lapsed, to clear a past due notice on the property taxes that no one was supposed to see, and I had paired those numbers with the text messages my mother sent to relatives in the same windows of time, where she told them, with practiced drama, that I had taken money again and that she and Tyler were doing their best to help me get back on my feet. I did not ask anyone to take my side because I have learned the hard way that truth lands better when it does not need a performance, so I let the papers pass from hand to hand while I explained, in a tone I could have used in a conference room, that I was done arguing over versions of events and done carrying the shame for other people's choices, and that the documents in front of them were not meant to humiliate my mother, but to end the debate over what I had supposedly taken, because I was tired of hearing that I was the drain when the ledger told a different story, and I was even more tired of being told that speaking up made me disloyal when the only loyalty that ever seemed to count was the kind that kept me quiet enough to be useful. My mother tried to cut in with the same move she always uses when the facts turn inconvenient, claiming that the transfers were loans she had asked me to handle because I was so good with money, and that if she had described me as struggling it was only to protect me from judgment. Yet before she could wrap the sentence in another selfless bow, Aunt Marcy, who has never raised her voice to anyone in her life, said in a low, clear tone that the dates did not lie and neither did the descriptions on the bank printouts, and then she asked my mother, without heat and without malice, why the messages to cousins read like a fundraiser for my flaws when the actual account history read like triage for Tyler's disasters. I will not pretend that moment felt sweet, because watching your own family realize they have been complicit in a story that hurt you is not some victory lap. It is a slow, human ache that mixes relief with grief, and yet I knew I had to keep going. Because the point of that envelope was not to win an argument, but to clear the path for the next thing, which was the only part of this night that truly mattered to me, protecting my grandmother Ruth before the next scheme ate her security alive. So I took out another stack of papers, thinner but heavier in consequence, and I said that when I found an old email where my mother floated the idea of borrowing against Grandma's house to help Tyler get a fresh start with a new business, I felt something cold settle in my chest, and that was the day I stopped trying to fix things with transfers and phone calls, and started calling lawyers instead, which is not glamorous and not free but very effective when your goal is to keep a vulnerable person safe. So with Ruth's full consent and a patient legal aid attorney who treated her like she mattered, we created a living trust that holds the house and a modest account for care, with clear language that prevents new liens and bars any borrowing that uses the property as collateral, and we named a trustee who is not my mother, because Ruth asked for that in plain words, and I respected her. I explained that starting next week a paid caregiver would show up on a regular schedule that was already booked through the end of the season, that the invoices were prepaid for the first block so there would be no excuse about cash flow, and that any family member who wanted to review the documents could do so after the party, preferably in daylight and with coffee, because this was not a gossip item or a punishment. It was a plan that addressed reality rather than fantasy. And it anchored Ruth in something solid for the first time in a long time. My mother called it theft, which did not surprise me, because any boundary looks like theft to someone who believes access is a birthright, and she accused me of cutting her out of her own mother's future. And she tried to bait me with the word inheritance, as if that would snap me back into the old dance where she dangles approval if I will only keep the money close and the truth closer. But I did not bite. Because there is a moment when you realize that protecting someone you love matters more than being loved by someone who only knows how to love with conditions, and I reached that moment months ago while sitting at a plastic table in a legal aid office, listening to an attorney explain, in simple sentences, that paper is how you close a door without slamming it. I turned to Ruth and asked, gently but audibly, if this was still what she wanted, and she nodded with that small, steady nod of hers that says more than any speech. And she squeezed my hand in a way that told me I could carry the guilt people were about to throw at me because she was not throwing it herself, and that gave me the steadiness I needed for the last move of the night, which was not a confrontation but a clock I had already set in motion. I pulled out my phone, felt more than saw my mother's eyes narrow, and I said, in the same even tone I had used all evening, that here is what happens in the first 24 hours when someone decides to stop being the family fixer. The scholarship announcement hits the community college bulletin with Ruth's name front and center. The church women's group receives a short message thanking them for their care and explaining that I am leaving and will not be available for emergencies, with a caregiver's contact attached so they are not left guessing, and the credit freeze on my file renews with alerts that no one can lift without me standing there in person, which means the old tricks will not work anymore. And then I looked at my mother and added that if she ever wanted a real relationship with me again, it would begin with a written apology to Ruth and to me that did not contain a single justification, followed by proof she was doing the kind of work that turns apologies into change. And before anyone could react, I let the moment breathe and asked, almost conversationally, if they were ready to learn what happens next, because the final step was already cued and there was nothing anyone in that room could do to stop it. The air in the room after I said those words felt like it had thickened to the point where every breath carried weight, not because I had raised my voice or slammed a door, but because everyone understood, in a way that could not be disguised or walked back, that the balance of power had shifted permanently, and the woman who had been treated as the dependable background player had stepped into a role she had been quietly building for years without ever announcing it. I could see my mother trying to summon that familiar smirk, the one she had always used to dismiss me as sensitive or melodramatic, yet it never quite formed, because somewhere in her mind she was doing the same math I had been doing for months, tallying up the legal filings, the certified mail, the scheduled transfers, the trust documents, and the prepaid caregiving invoices, and realizing that what had once been leverage was now little more than paper scraps compared to the structure I had put in place. I explained, calmly but firmly, that in the next 24 hours, 3 things would occur, not as threats, not as hypothetical promises, but as actions already set in motion that could not be stopped even if I changed my mind. Because that was the point of building systems rather than relying on emotional negotiations. First, the church women's group, which my mother has always relied on as a place to spin her side of the story under the cover of prayer circles and whispered concerns, would receive a scheduled message written in my voice, thanking them for their kindness toward Ruth, explaining that I was moving abroad and would no longer be available for the emergencies my mother had grown so skilled at manufacturing, and giving them the direct contact information of the caregiver already under contract, which meant the safety net could not be twisted into a tool of manipulation anymore. Second, the scholarship fund bearing Ruth's name would announce its first application cycle on the Community College Bulletin, with criteria designed to help students who worked while studying and had no parents willing to co-sign loans, which meant that for the first time in this family's history, money would flow toward responsibility rather than away from it. Third, the freeze on my credit file would renew automatically, complete with fraud alerts that would trigger phone calls to me alone, ensuring that no account could ever again be opened under my name without my knowledge, and in saying it out loud, I wanted them to understand that the game had ended not with shouting or ultimatums, but with paperwork that outlasted every excuse. Tyler muttered under his breath that I was abandoning the family, that I was proving I had always thought I was better than everyone else, but I did not respond to him with anger, because what I felt was something closer to exhaustion mixed with release. So I told him simply and clearly that if he ever wanted to hear my voice again, he could begin by repaying the outstanding balance of the last emergency transfer I had made to cover his late fees and the cost of the tow truck that had just hauled away his car, and until then, I wished him luck but had nothing more to offer. It was the first time I had ever given him a boundary without padding it with sympathy, and judging from the stunned look on his face, it was also the first time he realized I meant it. My mother, however, could not let go so easily, and she demanded to know what kind of daughter walks away from her own blood, what kind of woman humiliates her family in public, and what kind of person thinks paperwork and transfers matter more than loyalty. I looked her in the eye, without flinching, and told her that loyalty built on silence is just servitude dressed up as virtue, and that the only way she could be part of my life going forward was if she wrote a letter of apology addressed not just to me but to Ruth as well, a letter that did not contain excuses, did not shift blame, and did not lean on half-jokes to soften the edges. I told her that along with that letter, she would need to show receipts of actual therapy sessions, proof that she was doing the work of dismantling the habits that had poisoned every corner of this family for years. Until then, I was finished being the buffer, the shield, and the scapegoat. It was at that moment that Ruth, who had been watching quietly, slipped a folded note into my hand, her fingers trembling just enough to make the gesture feel like a secret gift. And when I opened it later in the back of the rideshare taking me away from that house for the last time, I found words written in her small, neat handwriting that will stay with me forever. I knew you would leave when you were ready. I wanted you to. I trust you. What I learned afterward, through the attorney who helped us set up the trust, was that Ruth had insisted on one additional clause, a safeguard almost no one knew about, if my mother attempted to smear me again in writing. If she told relatives lies in messages or letters, the trust would automatically shift oversight from her entirely, passing into the shared hands of Aunt Marcy and a neutral accountant, removing any chance of retaliation cloaked as estate planning. That small clause, hidden until the right moment, was Ruth's way of telling me she had seen everything more clearly than I realized, and that she wanted my escape to be protected long after I boarded the plane. When the car pulled away from the curb, I did not look back at the house because I no longer needed to, and the voice in my head was not my mother's cutting laughter or Tyler's muttered accusations, but my own words from the beginning of the night. Words that no longer carried fear. I am moving abroad for good. For the first time, they sounded not like a threat or an escape plan, but like a declaration of freedom, and as I sat there holding Ruth's note, I thought about how many years I had wasted waiting for permission to claim my own worth. So when people ask me later how it felt to walk away, I will tell them it was not about triumph or revenge. Even though those elements were present, it was about ending a cycle that had kept me in a role I never chose, and about proving to myself that I could leave clean, without bitterness, without begging, and without debt. And if they press for a final statement, the only words I will give them are these: this changes the rules forever. Because once you know your true worth, once you stop asking for permission to live, there is no going back to the old script, and there is no one left who can make you play the part of disappointment again.